are. Everything is fixed. We are all good.
It's questionable as to whether things are all good or things are fixed. Just giving a few seconds to check and make sure that all of the stuff is doing the stuff. I think we're all at full capacity now.
The stuff is doing the stuff. I think it's doing the stuff.
It's accurate technical terminology to describe the back side of the work.
Well, and this much we know is I can't do all the things. That's what we figured out while you were gone. So as I told you earlier, no more vacation for Phil Martin. That is over with. That's not going to happen anymore. And all is good.
I am not pleased by this outcome.
Well, nobody asked you.
Apparently. Very apparent. All right. So,
by the way, I got to say, I agree with partially your answer on Sunday. 1812 Overture is fantastic. I mean, when I was growing up, my parents had a turntable. We had that on vinyl, and I probably wore that record out. Just that section, man, towards the end, it just makes you want to go out and find a canon, doesn't it? I mean, just wants you to. It does. Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is in the cross section of classical music that reaches beyond its typical audience. It's top. It's one of the best. There's some great pieces, though. There's some great obscure works by all of the known composers that are really cool, too.
By the way, your co-pastor there seconds my idea, no more vacations. Michael West says, no more. You don't get to go anywhere. Done. It's done.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yep. And he's the guy, right? So it's done.
Yeah, and he just wants to go on the vacations with me. I think that's what it comes down to. Terry's fixing some settings somewhere. We'll let him do that. So for our topic today, Terry and I talked it over, and we thought we would kind of circle back around to an important subject. And we're going to discuss what about evangelism for our purposes right now in a pandemic. And really, you can think about it in a different sense. What about evangelism when you don't get to control where you go? There are brethren I know who are incarcerated because of crimes they have committed. There are brethren I know who are living in communities and parts of the world where they don't have free access to transport, to deciding where they go for all kinds of reasons. And yet the gospel still flows and rolls in those communities too, just like ours. And so one of the things that Terry and I kind of laid out as we would like to talk about today is hitting again some core ideas to help us be more efficient, effective, and encouraging in evangelism today. Everything's changed and nothing's changed for a lot of this. And so Terry, let's kind of get right at it and see you've got your camera issues sorted out.
For now.
Our first kind of key point that we laid out to discuss is the encouragement side. More so, at least from my perspective, more so than in a typical context, it's going to require an extra level of emotional kind of hug/push to get people comfortable into that idea of reaching out, because we're being told by the same world forces that surround us not to reach out, not to hug, not to touch, not to interact, not to get closer than 6 feet, etc. I think that's probably, at least in my mind, the first thing we have to remember is that we can still be encouraged to reach out. We just have to adjust our method. Absolutely.
And I think right now, because we are so just anxious and discouraged by everything, it's even more important for us to really be encouragers. Yeah. And that's across the board, just not just evangelism, but to really build up just that idea that there still is this opportunity. You've not lost that just because of the current situation that's going on. And that's the challenge, right? Is, and especially, by the way, let me say this, when it comes to evangelism, as preacher, we need to understand that that's not just the preacher's job. In fact, you know, one of the things about the three things that we've kind of laid out to talk about is, especially that word equip in a minute. I mean, our first priority is to do these three things so that we're all, as the body, involved in this process. Yeah. And that's the challenge for us that we need to realize and take on.
Right. Here's something that I was kind of processing this morning. Everybody's in the same boat. We may not have the same perception of what the seas look like. The master is willing to go and sleep on a boat when the storm rages, and the rest of us get anxious. We get nervous and we get concerned, and we're out of sorts and not quite sure what to do. And we see some people grabbing life vests and putting them on. We see others completely unaware that we're all in the same boat. And you can use that analogy to talk about spiritual things or physical things right now. But that's all of us. And so the first package of a determined effort to spread the gospel is accepting that reality, accepting that we are in the middle of constant chaos in life. And our role isn't to complain about the wind, it's to point to the rock. Hey, how much better would it be over there? What if we could get out of this boat, who may or may not be sinking, and go hang out on the rock? And that's an encouragement perspective to evangelism, that you're really trying to tell people now's an okay time. It's okay. Like, it's the right time to do that.
Yeah. Sunday morning, I preached a lesson that kind of dealt with some of this. And one of the things I said was that when I think about 2020, what I think about is that the devil's winning 2020, because he's got us so distracted and discouraged by all this stuff that we're no longer doing the things we need to do. And it's a combination. When you think about what this year offers in the form of distractions, it's not just COVID-19, it's not just racism, but you can add the election cycle to that, which is a whole nother ball of distraction, right? So when you put all that stuff together, I think we as a whole, if we're not careful, like you said, we're focused on all the wrong things. We're focused on the storm, the waves. We're focused on the boat itself. What we're not focused on is the rock. And what we're really not focused on is the good news. And I think that's the thing. We really need to be focused on the fact that in all of this, we still have the good news. The good news about Jesus Christ is the solution. And we need to be encouraged by that ourselves, but also encouraged to share that with other people. Look, in a sense, Phil, right now, people, we've said for years that in times of turmoil is when the gospel is the most receptive to other people. Well, I mean, since 2001, what better opportunity have we had than 2020 to share the gospel message?
Yeah.
And instead of thinking about it that way, all we could think about is arguing about masks and politics and all this other stuff that in the end is a distraction from sharing the good news about Jesus Christ. And so that's the key. Look, you tell people, hey, you're worried about disease? I serve a great physician. I mean, talk about those kind of things. It's ripe for the discussion right now. And we're letting that go away because of our own misfocused kind of thoughts and actions right now.
Ben Young, who's coming in to the feed from Twitter, BJ says, Satan gets us to focus on the frustrating friction instead of fortifying the foundation. A, I love the alliteration, but B, I also love even more deeply the point.
Well done with the alliteration. That's fantastic.
Really, yeah. Hey,
I'm a fan.
Yeah. Do you have a newsletter I can subscribe to?
Yeah. I send you my sermons and you can add some of those in for me. Let's
Ghostwriter.
Yep.
Okay,
yeah,
Ghostwriter.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So here's some things to think about that I think are kind of connected to that. In that context, from the first step of encouragement, of saying, let's get out there, let's remind people about the things that matter. We've got to then kind of build a mental transition point that says, while I encourage and while I strengthen, I do have a very concrete goal in mind. It is not merely to clear the hedges of distraction that the world, the devil, and ourselves build into our sightlines. It's to give clear and direct focus to the things that genuinely matter. So I'm going to, Terry talked about his sermon Sunday. I'm going to talk about mine, Nehemiah 6. It's interesting to note that that's probably one of the earliest instances in the ancient Near East of an open letter causing distraction from the things that matter. As a early participant in a different open letter than Sambalot's, I can tell you that what you want it to do and what it actually do never happen. And we all get distracted and we get hurt and we get destroyed and broken, whether you write the letter, read the letter, participate, because in the end, your goals never match the world's goals. And very often we get co-opted into this matters more right now. When what really matters is our spiritual relationships in Jesus, the spiritual good that we can do, the things that we can accomplish that draw people to Jesus and tell them that the real answers to their turmoil can be solved in that clear focus in heaven. It doesn't mean we don't deal with the rest of the stuff. We do and should and must. And we deal with kindness and compassion and courage and boldness and plain speech. But in the end, our goals really have to be refined. And so I think kind of thinking through this encouragement side, which is really that point to the rock side, in the equipment category, there are some things that will probably change. Encouraging, evangelizing, exhorting in the context where physical connection is more limited is fundamentally weird. Here's the thing to think about. For 20 years, Terry and I, up until the most recent year and a half or so, have been trying to build the skills to communicate in person. It takes a lot to figure out how to do effectively on a weekly basis. Figuring out how to communicate effectively in a visual medium is a whole new set of skills. And there's a reason why there are only a few high-level competent news anchors who can do that job, because it's a lot that goes on at once. Not every newspaper editor and writer all of a sudden becomes a contributor at a national outlet. It's a lot of skill change. Well, evangelistically, there's going to have to be some additional skill boxes that are going to be figured out, understood, practiced in, dug through and say, okay, we got to have this component and that component, and to figure out how to connect those pieces better. And so that's something we should probably talk a little bit about from the preacher teacher standpoint. Terry, what are your thoughts right there?
Well, we live in an odd time for sure. And here's the thing. It's like you said, this transition to more of even a nonverbal kind of participation, that predates COVID. I think that's one of the things people need to understand is a lot of the stuff that we're having to do differently, we had to start that earlier on than this. Now, you and I chose to do that. We were blessed, I think, I don't know if you thought about this, we were blessed to have at least a foundation, but rather than being forced into that last second. I'm grateful for that. But still, there was this need to be more digital in your approach and all those kind of things. And as you said, not everybody's cut out for that, but that's been around before the pandemic. The pandemic just made it a more clear reality to other guys. We've talked about guys that did not want any part of this that are doing it now. Now that change, by the way, to more video graphic based interaction is here to stay. I think we both agree with that. Wouldn't you say that?
It was already here to stay before we accepted the reality.
That's what I'm saying is, it's been here. It is here. There's the days of sending out CDs and cassette tapes are over. It's now, and even truthfully, podcasts are still hanging on, but video is where it's at, and graphics is where it's at. So that's something that's been a change for all of us. I think what's lost in that shuffle when it comes to the entire congregation is just the understanding of how that works in their hands. What they do with a video, what they do with a post from their congregation or another congregation that they find to be uplifting or encouraging. And so let me tell you what you do. You obviously like it, so we know that you see it. But for most, I don't know about where you're at, Phil, but for the majority of the people I know, that's all they do is they like whatever happened. But if all you're doing is liking the video, you're not giving the fullest potential in this area. There's a share button. That's what we're talking about. You need to share. So think of it as you've got your circle, I've got my circle, and everybody has their own circle. But if only circle that's ever touched is the church Facebook page, let's use that as an example, which is generally just the members and a few community members, that circle gets this way. But if every member then shares that, then instead of one circle, now we have 20, 25, 30 circles that are broadcasting this. Which means if we do this right, it's way more powerful when we all participate. I think that's one of the things that sticks out to me in this kind of medium we're in.
So I'll say it this way. For years, Christians have come to me and they've said things like, I'm not very much an outward person. I'm not an extrovert. I don't feel like I have a large circle of friends. What can I do to help share the gospel? Okay, now's your time to shine. You can do 30 things, super easy. And Terry just hit on them. In the social media context, we're going to shift to another one in a second. You can like the stuff you like. Step one, absolutely every single time someone has a sermon, you hear it, you like it, like it. If it's a Bible class, comment. Even if your comment is, you're doing a good job, I really appreciate it. If you don't have a question, comment.
Yes.
And then if you really want to maximize the reach, the space of getting the message that you love to the people you love, it's ultra simple. Share. Hit the little share button that says, I'm sharing this. I realize that's probably in the layers of comfort from, easy to a little bit of discomfort to have maximum discomfort of having a sermon on your Facebook page is uncomfortable. And I'll say this way. As someone who started sharing his sermons, where I'm the one on the screen.
That's uncomfortable. That's
on my
uncomfortable.
own page.
Yeah, that's uncomfortable.
Super uncomfortable.
Super awkward. Like, hey, come listen to me. That's super awkward, right? I mean, yeah. And here, let me say this. So I'm just going to throw this out there because I see a lot of y'all's Facebook pages. Okay. And if I don't see your Facebook page, I see other people's Facebook pages like y'all. I don't know why it's awkward to share a sermon based on some of the stuff you share already. I'm just going to be blunt, okay? Like, and COVID has been a great test case for this. We share stuff on that issue we're passionate about, quite frankly, regardless sometimes of how much sense it makes, okay? And that's not being judgmental, it's just true. If you'll post a meme about something that you think is witty or whatever, I don't understand why you would do that when you don't even know the content creator or half the time the factuality of what you're sharing. It's just something you like versus something that's from the most important piece of information from a source that you trust and from a place that you believe in. I don't understand why we can share all this other stuff, but we can't share this because it's awkward. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, but that's just how I feel about that.
Is it the box in the back right corner? Is that the soapbox back there?
No, that's a box of T-shirts. But anyway, that's the whole nother thing. Yeah. Which oddly enough are evangelistically attached. I mean, that's part of our
That's my
program.
point here. Yeah, we are willing to do things that are emotionally risky in one area of our life, but not in areas that may have an impact that we complain about. On a personal level, look in the mirror and say, have I complained about not seeing enough new faces at the church where I worship? Okay, well, how can I personally be a participant in making things wonderful? And that's really, again, an easy step. Peyton asked the question, how can you go about sharing it without coming off as boasting to others? We'll just be bad at it, and then everyone will be okay.
Is that my Peyton? Is he watching on Twitter? Is that where he's at?
No comment. No comment. That's a Peyton. But really, here's an accepted reality. Yeah, here's an accepted reality. If I have it built in automatic that the sermons that are preached at Eastside Sunday morning go to my personal Facebook page. I kind of got comfortable with accepting that reality. And generally the stop pages for that sermon look kind of like this.
Yeah.
Once you already get comfortable with that and accept that your goal isn't to look cool or to have a perception of how you think people are going to think about you, and your goal is just to say, this matters to me, then it matters. And it's okay. Next little step to think about in this process of equipment is that's just one area, like, comment, share, that's a social media interaction. But there are other forms of interaction that we as individuals can continue to participate in. Email is still an effective way to remind people about things that matter. In addition to that, text messages still are a powerful way to interact with a certain audience, certain age group. They're more into interaction in that realm. Third thing to realize is that you can still meet in a public space, be perfectly safe distance-wise, and have a great Bible study and a great spiritual conversation. In fact, I'll add one tidbit. Because people are so desperate for human interaction, you are probably at a higher time than ever you're going to find of getting people to say yes if you put it in a place where they felt safe to be in. Jay talks about a thing that's really important. He said a preacher used to do a radio program and thought it wasn't reaching out until he went to a prison and a prisoner recognized his voice. For 5-6 years, I did a live radio call and answer show in Cookeville, Tennessee. And I would go to garage sales and people say, do I know you? Your voice sounds really familiar. And I'm like, I don't think we've met yet. We don't know where the seeds fall.
I did a show for a couple of years in Nashville, and similar experiences, even in a place like Nashville, it's bigger, but also found out in other places they had heard that radio show through the internet and had actually obeyed the gospel. And we didn't know about that for a couple of years. Yeah. You don't know what's going to happen eventually from the work you're doing. And that's one of the things you've got to keep in mind.
I want to add one more little component in the equipping area. Especially as congregations figure out how to safely assemble to the guidelines that are relevant to their state. We're not going to really get into the detail of state to state differences. We're just going to assume that they're different. It's important in this context to build a place where you can have someone visit your assembly and they're going to want to be there and feel safe being there. Churches can be well considered as the realm in where, that should be a rescue place. And so our public assemblies, as odd as they may feel right now, should still feel like a place where a visitor can come in and not feel like it's a place they're not welcome and not wanted. And I have one more thing. This might differ from other folks. I'm not a big fan of labeled visitor spots. I feel like that pretty much basically says, let me make you feel awkward the entire time you're here, because everybody already knows you're a visitor. Instead, like we talked about before, I'm much more of a fan of building an attitude that says, hey, come sit near me.
Yeah.
Not next to, near.
I'm a fan of labeled visitor parking spots to make sure they have a spot that they can get into the door, especially if they're late. Outside of that, I don't want to single them out anyway. I want them to feel like they're part of the crowd, so to speak, or even part of the family, even though not saying they are, but I want them to have that feeling that they're welcome, that they're a part of what's going on, not as an outsider it's just allowed to spectate, which is what the visitor seat kind of sets aside if we're not careful.
Right. So we've got to build that on the equipment side, because equipping for evangelism is not only, though it is a part of it, making sure people know how to lead a Bible study. It is an overall approach to equipping the children of God to share the message to the people of the world who need to leave the world and be in the kingdom. And so there's all kinds of edges of that matrix that have to be paid attention to, which include some of the cultural challenges of today. People need to feel welcome and they feel like they belong from day one.
So let me sum this up as a good example of like all the different things we talked about. When you think about how you could share the gospel, or even share a message from the gospel with somebody, imagine for a moment that you just ate at the best restaurant of your life, or maybe you just found out a sale where you could get something that was such a good deal you couldn't believe it, and your best friend didn't know about that. How would you communicate with your best friend that they need to go eat at this restaurant, or they need to go to this place for this sale? You might send a message to their Facebook page. You might message them on Facebook. You might tweet them. You might call them. You might text them. You might email them. All of the things you would do to share that news that you're so excited about, that you bought this outfit for $5 and how fantastic that was, or this is the best lasagna you've ever had in your life, and you couldn't wait to tell somebody. All of the ways you would do that, you should do the same things with the gospel.
Yeah.
It's that simple. So, if you're one of those people that post a picture of your lunch on Facebook, because
we love you. We love you, by the way.
We love you. But let me ask you this. What would be wrong about posting a picture while you're assembling? I mean, I know some people get mad about it. I have no problem with that. I have no problem if you snap a picture on your phone and share that that doesn't bother me. Now, I have a problem if you start playing Candy Crush, right? But there's things you can do, and we do that with everything else, but we don't do it with this. And I just think it's backwards, truthfully. I think it's a upside down sense of our priorities.
Let me turn the camera around a little for a second and talk about how it impacts the teachers, preachers, evangelists when there's positive feedback and negative. Over the last 4 months, we've been doing more of these things. And one of the things that is powerfully shifted me is to see people from all across the spectrum of my life interact with the spiritual conversations that I'm part of. From young men who I helped complete their journey to Eagle and Boy Scouts, who now have served in the U.S. military and are back home with their families, to fellow evangelists, friends from my youth, to neighbors and locals. All of them interacted in different ways. And every positive interaction emboldens me to do more in the same area, just as much as every critical interaction could dismiss it, although I tend to now try to put that as, okay, I need to improve here. If there's a criticism, let's work it out. Let's see if it's just, let's see if it's fair. And even if it's not, maybe it includes just a few parts that I need. Chris talks about simulcasting the radio program to the internet. I'll tell you that there's some advantages on the top level that I would think about. Working with a radio station, if it's done in person at their station, instantly gives you a high quality product. And so what you're paying for could be thought more of as rental of the space to produce your broadcast versus paying them to broadcast it. The broadcasting of it could be considered an outgrowth in both of those areas. Then it goes to the live radio. It also goes to the recorded podcast or live internet forms. So you kind of reframe your thinking. You can do one more thing if you wanted to for that radio broadcast and bring in a camera and video yourself while you're doing it and share that. And then I'm sure most boards, I used to work on both sides of the table in radio settings, they can send you a feed of the audio that's perfect, and it can go right to your device. And now that audio is perfect. Your video will be perfect if you just use an iPhone and some good lighting, and boom, you now have a great product that you can share about spiritual things.
Chris's question was about the expense of that and the justification of that.
Right.
And my answer to that is, look, that's a question everybody faces. But I would remind you in Matthew 13, the parable of the soils doesn't tell us to only sow seed on good ground. Like that's not the point of the parable. The parable was to sow seed and let it fall where it may. And so if it comes to justification of something like that, you have to make that decision, is my answer. And look, I did that for a while. We stopped. I will admit cost was part of the concern with that, because it was also cost versus ratings and time slot. There's a lot that would go into that. Okay. But at the end of the day, if you have people listening and you have what you can tell is an audience, keep in mind that evangelism as a whole is not baptizing people. Evangelism is sharing the good news of Jesus, whether people obey it or not. And that's part of our misunderstanding in this subject to begin with, that we kind of have to wrap our heads around.
Right. And here's one more thing that fits into that, process of consideration. There's a secondary benefit to the process of building the skill to speak live, recorded, or otherwise, particularly if you make it a group activity. One of the things that we did when I was in Cookeville working with the Jerry Wilson Road Church in that live program is that we rotated guest hosts. So I was there most every Sunday. The guest was there from the congregation every Sunday, sometimes one of the elders, sometimes some of the members, one of the deacons. In the end, not only did they improve their ability to interact in that way, because it's nerve-wracking, but we built a better relationship. We who were serving together built a better relationship together, which strengthened the local work. And so there are other reasons why you may engage in evangelism, especially when you kind of shift as to what you consider the result desired to be. And Ben also had, BJ had another comment that I think is really important. Says when he trained baristas and sales for the cafe, I encourage them to forget about the cafe. And I think a part of that can be thought about this way. When someone comes there, they are the important thing. The person who comes in is the important thing. And that's one of the things I think that makes a company like, say, Chick-fil-A stand out, is they uniquely understand that in their brand, what they value is the customer, not the customer's wallet. And I think that's a shift in mindset that helps them shift a lot of their programming, a lot of their plans. And so there's a number of components that are really important there, that are things that we can put into the equipment side of evangelism that will allow the seed to do whatever God wants that seed to do. One plants, one waters, God gives increase. He has a hand in all of those things, including who has what's role, whether you're a planter or a waterer. I mean, that's part of his end of the equation that I think is really interesting and really important. Which brings us to, the last clause of our conversation, which is, I've got it noted as exhort. And it kind of connects to Chris's corner of the questions that we've been looking at. What do we do when things don't work the way we want them to do? There's a couple of layers. First layer is do not be dismayed when technology doesn't behave. Because Terry and I have both experienced that, both recently, but also over the course of the last 2 years of doing this thing. Technology never behaves. Everything, and I'll expose myself in this way. If the live feed doesn't reach the destinations that I designed it to go to, and one of my brethren calls and says, hey, the feed isn't live, I probably take that way too personal, as a level of I failed to do the thing that I planned to do. When in reality, it has very little to do with what I did in step A to step B, because sometimes The ones and the zeros just don't line up. Second layer is trying to figure out how effective it was. It's interesting when you talk about the advertising components of a marketing program, and all this stuff is in there. There's a lot that could be in that context that's important. And I think it's just important to kind of pay attention to all of those details clearly and openly. So like, comments, and shares are great tools to figure out how you can help, but they have little to do with what's called reach, viewer retention, and some of the other internal metrics to figure out if did the seed that I was sowing go as far as the wind would push it. Because even today, as I kind of look through the results of the work at Eastside, the work of Do the Work, some of our Bible studies, it takes a little bit of time to break all that down and understand it in an effective way. And so just because it has 300 views doesn't mean it was effective in the way that I planned. Or 50 views doesn't mean it was effective in the way that I planned. That isn't the metric that I'm looking for. And so I think that's important to talk about a little bit on the exhortation side. Terry, I know you've done a little bit of recent research in targeting ads, and I think it might be a spot where we can kind of put these two pieces together real quick.
Well, so I think one of the things that we've started doing is, and let me say this is a recommendation to whoever's doing your video stuff, is we used to target our ads by just sharing the entire sermon. And since COVID, that what we used to stream was just the sermon. Now we stream the entire service, and that's a lot to try to promote and try to send to people. So one of the things we started doing is editing a section out of the sermon that basically serves as like a blurb or a trailer for about 30 seconds max. And that's what you post with a link to hear the whole sermon. And that's what you promote, because the chances of somebody sitting down to watch a 50-minute assembly, including singing where only the song leader's mic'd, and which, by the way, is not the best look, right? In fact, what we should probably do, and we're just not because of the time, is go back and edit out everything but the sermons and post just those. We're just not there yet. Maybe I will eventually. But if you can give them a blurb, kind of like a movie trailer that says, oh, I think I want to hear this. And that's what you promote. And then the other thing you've got to do is you just need to keep in mind when you're promoting, you can set those limits and boundaries to a way that gives you the best effect. So there's no sense of like on Facebook, you can limit the miles from a destination. There's no sense of me advertising my sermon truthfully in Florida. It needs to be locally. If it gets there because people share it, that's fine. And then you can restrict age demographics. You can even restrict platforms. You know, Phil, one of the things you and I've talked about is if you just put every platform, probably 85% is going to be on somebody's phone these days. That's where we're going to run into it, which is why it needs to be 30 seconds. People don't look at their phone usually for 25 minutes. It's a quick thing, and they may come back. They may never go to your video link, but they may go back to your page to see further things. Yeah. So that's what seems to work right now is video and short 30-second clips that can be put. By the way, 30 seconds, one of the reasons is magic numbers. If you're on Instagram, that's kind of their limit without going into the IGTV side. So you could post a 30-minute clip, a 30-second clip, and they don't flag you for anything. It's less intrusive that way.
Right. And so earlier I gave one example of how people can participate in evangelism in the current context, and we can equip them to do so. That's that like, comment, share. Here's a second one. If you're in an assembly, you're listening to a sermon, the congregation you're part of, and the sermon has a message or a statement that just hits you in a way that you really feel moved by. The best thing you can do to help in the current context is to, one, write down what time it was and tell the preacher, hey, at about 10:05 in your sermon, and what you said really mattered. And then talk to him about it, like why it mattered. Because that gives him the ability to go back and go, okay, at 10:05 in my sermon, this is what I was saying. I'm going to cut that part out. And that's going to be the thing that I share because I know it resonated with someone I care about. I know it connected with them in a way that was important. Ruth asked about target key interests for advertising. For me, it's more about paying attention to the demographics of the area. And so I will almost always lean into who uses the medium I'm advertising in the most. Because I'm not trying to narrow the focus. I'm trying to keep it broad. But for effectiveness of the dollar, I might increase the demographics to say, okay, this area is predominantly over the age of 60. So I can just go ahead and do that. And that means it's going to target over the age of 60. It means because the people who live there are over the age of 60, not the general audience.
Yeah. Sometimes what's good too is to figure out your area is to cast a broad net. And every time you look at the analytics, you get back. And then the next time you narrow that down a little bit more. And usually what I suggest doing is in your area, if you're using Facebook, for instance, which is usually the platform for this, do it about 2 or 3 times and each time adjust a few things and see if you start. What you're wanting to do, as Phil said, is maximize the money you're spending for the most return. So in my area, 35 to 44 years old is the sweet spot in my area. That makes up, if I were to broadcast to everybody, that makes up almost 3/4 of my audience just naturally. So if I go ahead and restrict it to that, then I know that's going to be the sweet spot. And women are about 65% of that. So if I was going to maximize my dollar, I would try to restrict it, even if I could, by gender and that age demographic, and maybe even to phones only, because that's the sweet spot for the most return on what you're spending. That doesn't mean you don't care about anybody else. It just means if you're going to spend this money, you want to spend it in the most effective way. And by the way, that's kind of reflective just of other surveys and studies about who's most interested in religious things. Females are generally more interested than males in that. That's sad to say, but it is true. And that age of being a mother of 35 to 44 factors into that as well. So that's kind of where I'm at. Where I live, that's the demographics for me.
And I'll add a contrarian point is something to think about. For a long time, when I'm preparing a sermon, I actually have in my mind an invented person that I'm preaching to. That person represents not just the current demographics of the area, but the person that I want to reach the most.
That would change everything in that sense.
Right. The person who's not part of our assembly, the person who's not interested enough to be there in person, per se. And I'm trying to figure out how to reach them. So the contrarian perspective is that once you realize the demographics of what you're already getting skews a certain way, you actually market to the rest. You market to the margin, not the mass. Because I'm not selling the product, that mass already is going to see it in other ways. But if I can get the margin interested, then that margin will lever the mass far more than the mass will lever the margin. Again, in the context of Coweta County, especially around where our building is located, trends to an older age demographic. A lot of the communities there are significantly retirement focused. And so for me, what I actually do at times is skew the audience the other direction to look at that margin, because that dollar goes deeper in that marginal audience. And in many ways, the marginal audience is farther from me. So I have to reach farther to capture them. Both of those principles are good.
To that point, for me, I'm in the fastest growing city in the state of Alabama that is mainly young families. It is that demographic I'm talking about. My area, the middle schools and high schools and elementary schools are overflowing. So what that tells me is that is my demographic in my area. Unlike Phil's, that's a more of a retirement kind of end of things. Mine is this growing first home, maybe second home kind of families, that's where I'm at. So all of that plays into that. You can do either one, but your community, because the other thing is I restrict that by mileage, and I'm sure you do, Phil, as well. Basically 10 miles away from where I'm at is my limit. I want to, for a lot of reasons, but I want to compact that down. Those are my most likely people to get an opportunity with, the ones that are here.
Right. And, our markets has a lot of similarities. Actually, our schools are all overflowing, but that's on the outskirts of our community, not in the interior of our community. And the interior of our community is diverse ethnically, it's diverse age-wise, it does lean older. And so I've got to make sure that I'm making the right interests, the focus, with one more caveat. The message has to be the kind of message that makes them want to know more. Not just watch it once and never come back. It's the message that says, I would really like to go be part of that group, or I would really like to meet that family. Because as we've talked about before, for the most part, the brand of the church is the people. Almost exclusively, the first easy step is to realize that a congregation's brand are the people who love Jesus, because they should be reflecting Jesus. And so that's the caveat, last phrase there. We've got to close out for time's sake. But Terry, we can do the round the horn, because it's time to go around the horn. Last comments before we close up?
Well, I think one of the things you need to do with evangelism is share your success stories. I think that's, I'll just leave that with you. We, under normal circumstances, when we can, we have a group that meets, just anybody wants to come once a month, and we share people to pray for. We share successes. We share things, good interactions, bad interactions. That discussion, that's a tremendous part of this encouraging and exhortation and even equipping. It really helps out. And that's something that I think is really needed. I think we just don't talk about evangelism enough, and that needs to be a subject we bring up on a regular basis. So I would encourage people to think about that going forward.
I want to extend my broad thanks to everyone for participating today. This is a subject that Terry and I have continued to be pretty passionate about, the intersection of evangelism and visual media, and doing so in an effective way. And visual media now kind of goes into audio-visual media, and because of the context that we're in. But in all things, like we've tend to say throughout the course of the last 4 months or so, if we can be of service to you in spiritual ways beyond just understanding evangelism better, please let us know. If you have questions about the work, questions about what Terry and I do, or want to know more, just drop us a link. We're happy to chat and talk a little bit. Otherwise, take care, everybody, and have a great day.